Good evening, Zambia. This is Season 1, Episode 4 of the DBM Chat Hour podcast, which comes to you every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Central African Time. Tonight, we will be tackling the question, how do I realign my identity? Understanding physical identity. Part 2. Welcome to the fourth of the 21 sessions of the DBM podcast series on identity, mandate, and purpose. If you are joining us for the first time, my name is Blessed, and I'm your host. Last week, we began to explore the same question we will be exploring today, but started by laying a foundation on understanding the physical identity, Part 1. During which we investigated the 16 personality types, referencing specifically the MBTI Personality Assessment Model. We bridged the session from the previous week's session, during which we explored the different types of identity crisis and how to deal with them. We used a question from the audience that anticipated the unpacking of character and personality, which was the basis of last week's session. To catch up on our journey and be part of this exciting conversation, I encourage you to listen to the 3 previous sessions that we have already broadcast to build up on today's session. Some of you who made personal requests will be glad to note that our podcast sessions are now available on Spotify, so take time to listen. You can conveniently do so even as you drive to work, cook your dinner, or while you work out. As usual, we shall begin by responding to one of the questions from the audience to bridge us into today's topic, Understanding Physical Identity, Part 2. You will note that last week I mentioned that we would explore spiritual identity during today's session. However, because of the very pertinent question that was raised by one of our subscribers, we will take time instead to expand further on realigning identity and understanding physical identity before we proceed to explore spiritual identity. This is important because without understanding physical identity, it is highly unlikely for us to fully understand spiritual identity. Like I have said before, one of my very significant spiritual lessons from my rabbi is that we learn spiritual insight from the natural things, and once we understand this, we are able to perform the invisible spiritual function, which then results into the visible physical manifestation. So today, Understanding Physical Identity Part 2 will take a more practical look at realignment of physical identity so that it can be more practical for us to be able to put it into practice by our DBM chatters wherever you may be listening to us from today. I will do so by responding to the questions from one of our DBM chatters, Mukuka, who says, I understand that character builds your personality type, and character has a lot to do with your personal experiences and background. However, is it possible that in adulthood, your personality type can change? Or is personality type inherent from childhood? Mukuka, thank you so much. This is a brilliant question. And our aptness to understand the answer subsequently creates our capability to realign our self-identity in the event that it may have been realigned. So this question is very practical and will help us to clearly understand how to realign our physical identity. Like I mentioned in my online response to Mukuka, we must first be clear about the definition of character. According to the Britannica Dictionary, the definition of character is the way someone thinks, the way someone feels, and the way someone behaves, which collectively, as we discussed in the previous session, forms one's personality, which is usually singular. You will note that all three words, think, feel, behave, are all doing verbs. To think being the activity of forming in the mind. To feel being to experience a particular feeling or emotion. Or to have a particular opinion about or attitude towards something. To behave being to act or conduct oneself in a particular way. The fact that personality is singular is why the 4 broad personality types and the 16 personality subtypes attempt to describe one's personality using a singular descriptive terminology. One, for instance, would say regarding another person's personality, his personality type is one of a kind and sensitive person, or this is a side of her character that few people have seen, aggressive and violent. We will note that it is for this very reason that we see that most people tend to conceal their true character, because it is to a great extent inherent or underlying. It follows that one cannot predominantly change their core personality. However, it is worth noting that one can alter characteristics such as the way they think, or the way they feel, or the way they behave towards something. So personality type per se cannot change, but behavior, on the other hand, can be somewhat altered within one's original personality type, as some behavior is learned and other behavior is inherent. That component of behavior that is learned is the one component that can be unlearned. The component that is inherent can seldom be permanently changed. As we begin today's topic, to continue from part 1 last week, we will introduce specific personality types and use these as specifics to illustrate how identity can be realigned by altering selected behavioral characteristics of personality and not the actual personality broad type. Before we continue with altering of behavior, I would like to emphasize that physical identity is the part of your identity that is visible and tangibly relatable. In this case, because of our roadmap that will subsequently lead us to understanding spiritual identity, I will take the liberty to say that the physical identity we are now exploring is every part of your identity that is non-spiritual. Dr. Daniel O'Neill, author of Survival of the Fit, defines physical identity as the innate human drive we are all born with to move our bodies through space. However, for purposes of this journey, we will be looking at physical identity in greater depth. We will use the common description of physical identity, being the various visible components of an individual, as well as an individual's personality characteristics that are exhibited physically through visible and perceivable behavior patterns. For this purpose, and based on last week's discussion of personality types, we will assume that physical identity is that which is identifiable and inherently associated with a particular individual. We pointed out in an earlier session that career or profession is not one's mandate. However, one's occupation is often associated with an individual as their identity. It is very common to refer to an individual's identity by what they do, their occupation or their profession. This is why I mentioned earlier that career or profession can give us an indication of and be a springboard for realizing identity, but not defining identity. The reason why career is not equivalent to and does not define our identity is because self-identity is much greater than career or profession. In other words, profession or career is often merely a component of self-identity, and in some cases, where both career and profession are not by an individual's choice, these can be completely parallel to one's self-identity. Let us return to the altering of behavior to realign physical identity. Using the above definition, we shall look at some examples of how we would describe a specific individual's self-identity based on their personality characteristics. Note that the subject we shall use are fictional characters who we shall refer to as Subject A, Subject B, Subject C, and Subject D, and whom we have identified under the 4 broad personality types as well as the 16 sub-personality types. Subject A is a protagonist diplomat and could be described as one with the self-identity of a nurturing and preserving person. Subject B is a logician analyst with the self-identity of inventor and knowledge giver. Subject C is a defender sentinel with the self-identity of caring protector. Subject D is the virtuoso explorer with the self-identity of experimenter and master artisan. All these identities are physical identities which are informed by personality characteristics, and more often than not, these subjects' profession or occupation will play a key role in ushering them into their mandate, as well as informing their physical identity. Let us take, for example, Subject A, the diplomat protagonist, whom we have said is of the personality of being a preserver and a nurturer. If we go back into the MBTI model, which further describes the protagonist, we will discover specific characteristics that are associated to people with this personality trait. Subject A, the protagonist, with the ENFJ personality type, feels called to serve a greater purpose in life, is thoughtful and idealistic. This subject strives to have a positive impact on other people and the world around them, rarely shying away from any opportunity to do the right thing, even when doing so is far from easy. If one has identified under this personality type and subtype, for example, realigning their identity may require altering some of their personality characteristics towards the affirmative. Please note that the affirmative in this case does not necessarily mean that we are trying to turn every trait into a positive, including the negative traits. The negative traits help to create an equilibrium within an individual. It rather means that we are realigning towards the affirmative by positioning the trait to align with achieving the expected outcome that is in line with that particular individual's personality. We identify specific personality traits of the protagonist, assuming they are misaligned, and will attempt to realign them. It could be presumed that a protagonist who seems to have a negative impact on people around them or the world could alter their behavior by aspiring and attaining a positive impact on the people around them in order to realign with their inherent identity. If this protagonist tends to find themselves always shying away from doing the right thing, they may want to alter that behavior towards seldom shying away from doing the right thing, even when it isn't easy. Using the example of subject B, the logician analyst, who we said is of the personality of inventor and knowledge giver, has the characteristics of priding themselves on their unique perspective and vigorous intellect. This logician tends to prefer solitude, is easily immersed in their thoughts, is incredibly creative and inventive, unafraid to express their novel ways of thinking or to stand out from the crowd. A logician with a misaligned identity may want to activate a dormant creative and innovative mind and be more expressive of their novel ideas. Subject C, the defender sentinel, whom we said has a self-identity of a caring protector, in their unassuming, understated way, is one who helps make the world go round, is hardworking and devoted, and feels a deep sense of responsibility to those around them. This subject can be counted on to meet deadlines, remember birthdays and special occasions, uphold traditions, and show their loved ones care and support. They rarely demand recognition for everything that they do, preferring instead to operate behind the scenes. Subject C also has an excellent analytical ability and an eye for detail. Despite being reserved, has well-developed people skills and robust social relationships. A defender sentinel who does not seemingly contribute to the world going round may consider realigning their behavior towards this. One who is not hardworking may consider becoming more devoted and improving their sense of responsibility and commitment to meeting deadlines and remembering special occasions. If subject C tends to seek recognition, they may also consider refraining from this behavior, paying more attention to detail and improving their people skills and social relationships. Subject D, the virtuoso explorer, whose self-identity we described as an experimenter and master artisan, loves to explore with their hands and their eyes, touching and examining the world around them with an impressive diligence, a casual curiosity, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Subject D is a natural maker, moving from one project to the other, learning from their environment as they go along. They find no greater joy than in getting their hands dirty, pulling things apart and putting them back together, leaving them just a little better than they were before. The virtuoso may consider realignment by using their hands more often in the event that they didn't, develop a sense of curiosity and be more eager to learn from their environment. You will notice that with each of the four subjects, the realignment requires a change in feeling or thinking or behavior, or all three. The pattern we see here is that of moving from one thought process to another, or from one way of feeling to another, or from one way of behaving to an altered behavior. Note that we are not using the word alternative for behavior here, but rather we are using the word alter, because we are not substituting the behavior, but simply adjusting it. This means that in response to Mukuka's question that interrogates whether one can change their personality in adulthood or not, the response is that it is possible to change some behavior traits as long as they are not embedded genetically, but not necessarily to be able to change the personality type. This is because broad personality itself is genetically inclined, while personality characteristics can also be genetically inclined as well as acquired from learned behavior or socialization patterns. This could be the reason why the MBTI model further classifies, for instance, the protagonist as being either an ENFJ-A or an ENFJ-T, the identity scale being made up of assertive and turbulent personality traits. If you remember from our classification of the personality acronyms, we interpreted that ENFJ represents extrovert, intuitive, feeling, and judging. The suffix that we have just added, A, in the case of ENFJ-A, represents assertiveness. An assertive protagonist is one who views themselves with more confidence, while a turbulent protagonist tends to see themselves with less. You will notice also that consequently, even if you do not use the personality assessment tool, there are some personal characteristics about yourself that you unconsciously or consciously know should be and are part of your natural self. When we go against some of these, our instincts alert us that there is an imbalance within us. How we respond to this depends entirely on whether or not we are prepared to realign our natural identity to create an equilibrium within that will inform our self-identity. In qualifying that broad personality types cannot change as an adult, while behavior, on the other hand, can be altered, it must be stated that psychologists say that it can be anywhere between 18 to 124 days for a person to form a new habit and an average of 66 days for a new behavior to become automatic. Like seen in the examples of subject A, B, C, and D, the behaviors being altered to realign identity do not include the introduction or elimination of an absolutely new characteristic or trait, but rather the training and altering of an already existing one. In cases where there is an absolutely new introduction or elimination of personality traits, this usually results in an artificially instituted characteristic that does not have genuinity or any basis for continuity. One behaving in such a manner could be referred to in colloquial terms as a wannabe, or one aspiring to have an identity that is not synonymous with them. This could also include the suppressing of one's true identity in the hope of creating a different public perception to what actually is. This is why it is said of some people that is a side of them that many people do not know about. One reforming from an antisocial behavior, such as being an alcoholic, does not apply in this case and is something that is totally different. Such a behavior alteration can be viewed by society as a totally acceptable behavioral transformation. On the other hand, artificial behavioral alteration is commonly frowned upon by society as being deceitful or dishonest. It is important to remember that behavioral alteration is important and is socially accepted for the purpose of physical identity realignment, especially if it is in response to the need to align with one's spiritual identity and mandate. Next week, we shall embark on the discussion on spiritual identity by examining the question, how do I realign my identity? Understanding Spiritual Identity, Part 1. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel by pressing subscribe below the link. Like and share across your other social media platforms if you found this link useful. Remember to post your comments and questions below to be part of this life-changing conversation. Next week, we will begin the chat hour by answering any questions or addressing any comments that you may have. Remember that this plays a key role in bridging our sessions and will definitely do so to bridge the discussion, How do I realign my identity? Understanding Physical Identity Part 2, to the session, How do I realign my identity? Understanding Spiritual Identity Part 1, and establishing the link between the physical and spiritual identity. Your questions and comments also facilitate an interactive discussion, allowing everyone to be part of the conversation. Tune in next week, and thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you for subscribing, and thank you for sharing. DBM is your pleasure and our business.